Welcome to the Product Rising podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Rebecca Hinds. We are living in a moment when we are each examining, reckoning with, and hopefully moving toward understanding AI's promise of unprecedented efficiency. Dr. Hinds brings a deep perspective that feels especially urgent. With a PhD in organizational behavior from Stanford University, Dr. Hinds has spent her career examining how emerging technologies reshape power, collaboration, and accountability inside organizations. Long before AI became a board-level mandate, she was asking what happens to culture when we optimize communication and automate coordination. She is the author of a new book, Your Best Meeting Ever, where she argues that meetings are one of the most powerful design levers in any organization. Her work challenges leaders to treat meetings and all our interactions with colleagues as intentional acts where we spend time designing who speaks, who decides, and who is heard. Our conversation will explore the impacts of AI specifically on meetings and meeting culture, and explore what responsibility looks like in the design of modern workplaces. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for having me, Shannon. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yes, so am I. In your new book, which is great, you point out meetings are one of the most powerful design levers in an organization. AI is entering the space, and it's summarizing, it's analyzing sentiment, it's tracking participation, it's suggesting decisions. It's doing much more than that now. We have the avatars coming. So first, tell us, how do you see AI changing meetings and meeting culture today? What's happening out there in a nutshell?
So unfortunately, I'm seeing more examples of AI making meetings worse than the reverse. And I think that is a manifestation of a whole bunch of factors, but one in particular is the fact that for so long we've used meetings as a way to cognitively offload things that we should be doing ourselves. And we often use them as a lazy default for communication. Now, AI in many ways makes that easier, right? Because if you can send an AI note taker to a meeting instead of showing up yourself, that's a cognitive offloading activity that is tempting. It's tempting right now in a world where workers are overloaded and overburdened. Now, I am very excited in general about the role AI can play in meetings. I think it can give us much more information in terms of how we design these meetings, how do we make them more effectively. But unfortunately, most individuals, most teams, most organizations are not approaching the technology with that intentional lens.
Are there positive things that we can talk about with this evolution? There must be a few things because everybody's doing it.
Absolutely. And, when we think about AI in general, one of the most exciting applications of the technology is to remove the grunt work, remove the busy work that employees don't enjoy doing day to day. And when we think about meetings in particular, it's exciting because often this grunt work, the busy work, the note taking, the scheduling, the follow up, this is all important work. It's coordination work that is essential. Often it's put on the shoulders of women, disproportionately. And often it's work that people don't enjoy doing. And so to have AI then play the role of the scheduler, the transcriber within the meeting, that in theory allows us to spend more time interacting in the meeting, more energy interacting in the meeting, and approach meetings more intentionally. The insights we can gain are also really exciting. So starting to look at, okay, airtime in the meeting, how is airtime distributed? Not as a surveillance mechanism, but as a source of information, because meetings are hard to measure. That's one of the reasons why they're so dysfunctional. They're so hard to measure. It's so hard to end the meeting knowing whether that meeting has been successful, because the determination needs to be made by the attendees, not the organizer. And often you find the organizer is the one who leaves the meeting more satisfied than anyone else in the meeting. And that is because they have designed it. AI gives the organizer and the attendees more information in terms of, was this meeting successful? How might we improve this meeting in the future to be more successful and more valuable to the attendees who are the users of the meeting?
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask you what you thought leaders were not seeing with the advent of AI in meetings, but it sounds like one of the biggest things is probably the fact that they may be getting what they want out of the meeting, but the attendees may not. Would you say that's true?
I think that's a part of it. I think a bigger piece is leaders in general don't think enough about what is AI in service of within the organization and in service of in meetings. What are we optimizing for in meetings? Because that dictates how we then should deploy and enact the technology. If the purpose of the technology is to make our meetings more effective, then the outcomes are different in terms of how we treat the technology, how we approach the technology. If the purpose is to make our meetings more efficient versus effective, if the purpose is to improve communication, if the purpose is to improve customer satisfaction in these meetings, how we enact the technology, how we deploy the technology ought to change as well. And often, what I see in organizations, and it's a reflection of how overwhelmed people are right now, but often use the technology just to use the technology. And there's a performative aspect of it that often overshadows real intentionality.
Yeah, and that's actually a great segue because I do want to talk a little bit about the book that you wrote about meeting culture. You actually point out 7 principles of meeting design. I love it if you could go through what the 7 principles are briefly so people can understand the context. And then we can get back to the impact of AI and multiple variables within that list.
Sure. And the premise of the book is we need to treat meetings as a product. Meetings are the most important product in our entire organization. They're also the least optimized. And so if we are going to treat meetings like a product, we should be applying the same product design principles that make great products great. And so each of the 7 chapters walks through a product design principle applied to meetings. The first one being volume. So this one is all about cutting your meeting debt. We know that we have meeting debt just as we have technical debt in our product development. These shortcuts, the fixes that build up over time that no longer make sense and are mismatched based on what the current state of work is. So often this looks like legacy meetings on the calendar that you've had on the calendar for months and years. There's a sense of guilt associated with canceling them because often we take meeting cancellations personally. And so, how do we think about removing the debt from our calendar so that our calendar is much more lean and reflective of our current state of work?
Yeah, and following that measurement, I thought this one was really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I alluded to it earlier in terms of meeting measurement is so tricky. It's tricky because we have a visceral negative reaction to meetings. I call it the meeting suck reflex, such that you can't just ask employees, how effective are your meetings or do you enjoy meetings? Because you'll trigger that reflex, not the reality. So this chapter is all about how do you measure meetings effectively, taking analogies from product development, in particular in terms of return on investment or return on time investment.
And that should resonate with many in our audience who are somewhat affiliated with product management, if not product managers straight up. From there, we go into structure. How would you define that?
So, structure is about what I call becoming a meeting minimalist. So, how do we think about applying a minimalist lens, just as we would for product development, to our meetings? And the chapter walks through 4 dimensions of your meeting structure. So, the length, the frequency, the attendees, and the agenda items, and different strategies in terms of how do we make our meetings more lean across each of these dimensions.
I agree with you that lean is the goal. Now let's talk about flow.
Flow. So, flow is again heavily influenced by the world of product development and product design in terms of systems thinking. We often think meetings are the problem. Usually, they're a symptom of a bigger problem, and that is a broken communication system. And just as if a product keeps breaking, we don't just keep patching the bug, right? We step back, we look at the whole architecture. Meetings should be the same, and thinking about, okay, what is the role that meetings play in the broader communication system within an organization. A simple gut check is, do you have a specific rule for what deserves to be a meeting in our organization relative to other communication channels versus email versus Slack?
You have some tests for that. Um, the 4D test. What does that mean?
Sure. It's a two-part test. I call it the 4D CEO test. It's essentially a two-part test to determine, do we actually need a meeting? So first is the 4D test. A meeting should only happen if the purpose is to decide, debate, discuss, develop yourself or your team. Even if it passes that first test, there's a second test, the CEO test. The meeting needs to be either complex, there needs to be enough ambiguity, unknown unknowns, where a meeting probably is going to be most efficient. E, is it emotionally intense, right? If we're needing to manage emotions, interpret emotions, we're persuading someone or delivering hard feedback, right? It's so much more than about facts. It's about feelings, body language, empathy, super important. Or O, is it a one-way door decision? Meaning once you walk through the door, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to revert course and go back the other way. In those cases, which are relatively rare in organizations, but in those cases, it probably makes sense to schedule that meeting, ensure that everyone is aligned because the cost of misalignment is too high.
Yeah, okay. That makes a lot of sense to me. It's sort of the level of stakes that we're talking about.
Exactly.
Engagement is the next one.
Engagement, and this might be the closest to my heart, and I'm sure many product design, product development folks as well, in terms of who are you designing the meeting for, ensuring that you're approaching meetings with a user-centric design. Our users are our attendees. They are not ourselves as the meeting organizer.
Okay. Timing.
Timing, this one's about rhythm. I've long been fascinated by the idea of rhythm in organizations. And so this chapter is about, how do we think about timing our meetings relative to our strategic rhythm within the organization, to our tactical project rhythms, and how do we think about breaks as well? I call them strategic pauses in terms of no meeting days, no meeting blocks, and buffers between meetings.
Yes, I've been many organizations where we tried different days on the calendar for no meetings, and it starts out great. Then usually someone violates and then it's all over.
Mhm.
And finally, technology, which is sort of the focus today.
Yeah, so technology broadly, and there is a heavy focus on AI, but broadly, it's about how do we use technology in ways that support the meeting, don't overwhelm the meeting. And that relates to the use of video, it relates to the use of PowerPoint, it certainly relates to the use of artificial intelligence. How do we constantly, just as we would in product development, iterate and innovate how we're applying technology to our meetings?
When you spoke about intentionality, I'm wondering if there are certain types of meetings that are just well suited to the technology that's available. So AI solves the problem. Are there any types of interactions where you would say, yes, absolutely, go for it?
So there's the answer that intuitively makes sense, and that is, the more a meeting is focused on information exchange, the more AI is suited for that, right? Because AI can handle complexity in a way that humans cannot. Now, in general, if a meeting is focused on information exchange overwhelmingly, it probably shouldn't be a meeting. It should probably be happening asynchronously through other channels. And so AI is well suited for that. It's not necessarily well suited, or it shouldn't necessarily be used in meetings for that purpose. The biggest benefit of AI within, and I would argue outside of meetings as well, is to handle complexity in terms of organizational context, right? If AI knows enough about you, your team, your organization, it can help before, during, and after meetings. The natural spot is the pre read, right? Previously, humans would spend sometimes hours. At Amazon in particular, they spend days on pre reads. If AI knows enough about the content of the meeting, the context of the organization, it can help with a lot of that prep work in terms of taking on some of that very important work, but often busy work, monotonous work within the organization, and then being able to connect the meeting to the broader communication system. So this is very much in the systems thinking camp, where if AI knows what has happened in the meeting, it can then assign the action items. It can give you a sense of whether those action items have been completed outside the meeting. And you start to get into a world where meetings are no longer isolated from the rest of the organization. They're connected to the other communication systems. Now, that's difficult in practice. It's not something every organization is able to do with their current technology, but many organizations are starting to do this and starting to do this very well.
So sometimes it's very common to have, say, a Monday morning status meeting where everybody comes in and stands around the room. Is that an example of something where information exchange could be done with tech?
Absolutely. And, status meetings are very, very common still. And they're one of the biggest sources of meeting dysfunction because often we don't need to be in a meeting listening to 10, 20, sometimes 50 people give a status update. The gold standard, and this is starting to happen, it's definitely not the norm, but the gold standard would be okay, AI knows what is happening within the organization. It has a sense of everyone's goals and everyone's work and how much status they have made since the last meeting. For any status updates that are routine, that are, green light, nothing to talk about, AI can understand that and also understand, okay, what are the status updates? Maybe there's 2 out of 50, or maybe there's 3 out of 10 that are worth that discussion. They have a level of complexity. They have a level of emotional intensity. They're a one-way door decision where it does make sense to bring those forward to the meeting. And in that case, AI can start to advise on the agenda. Perhaps we can't do the entire status meeting asynchronously because some components of the status update pass the 4D CEO test. I'm going to recommend this as an agenda structure to the participants. And then you've intentionally designed the meeting so that the things in the meeting deserve to be synchronous real-time interactions.
So instead of the human leader having to sort through all 50 status updates, the AI can do that and then tell you which ones deserve an actual meeting. So that should cut down the number and the
Mhm.
hours.
Exactly. And I think we're months, probably months, if not years away from AI being able to do that on its own. The human would be in the loop and the organizer, just as all of our roles are shifting in the age of AI, the role of the organizer then shifts from gathering updates and designing the agenda from start to finish to then curating the agenda and vetting the agenda that the AI has proposed. And those are different muscles, equally important, if not more important, because you do need to be more intentional. But we should, as we think about how technology is changing within our organizations, in and outside of meetings, then think carefully about, okay, what does this mean for roles? And the meeting organizer is more of an informal role within the organization, but the same analogy holds for our formal roles as well.
Yeah, I am really interested in the areas where AI is being used to do meetings sort of wholesale. And you've pointed out that there are some types of meetings where you kind of should never use it. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about that. And that sort of goes along with the theme of using AI responsibly and trying to maintain what is human about work and collaboration and being together in an organization.
It's very important. And where I worry a lot is around these digital twins. You're sending either a note taker bot to the meeting instead of showing up yourself, or you're sending, an avatar or a digital twin that in theory is supposed to represent you in the meeting. I am not convinced my beliefs on this won't change over time as the technology develops, but I'm convinced right now that there are very, very few use cases where that is a healthy application of the technology. for many reasons. A big one is, what does that say to other attendees when you're sending a digital note taker instead of showing up yourself? And we're seeing this narrative around CEOs in particular, and these CEOs of meeting companies boast about now being able to send a digital twin to meetings. And the natural reaction from attendees, in particular lower status attendees within the organization, is, wow, my time is not valuable enough for you to show up as a human. Sometimes it's called mental proof, right? When people design a good meeting, and certainly when people show up as a human to the meeting, it conveys that you've put thought, intentionality, discipline into the meeting. You respect other people's time. That has long been a hallmark of the best leaders, is they treat others' time as more valuable than their own. And as my colleague Bob Sutton will say, they are stewards of other people's time. And so for one of many, many reasons, sending a digital note taker or twin to a meeting, I don't think is a best practice. I think there are few and far between in terms of use cases where that makes sense. One might be you're on vacation or you're on maternity leave and you have developed an avatar or an AI digital twin that is able to represent you reasonably within the organization. That might be a use case, but I struggle to think beyond that in terms of where this might actually be healthy for the organization at large and not just for the individual who is seeking to maximize their productivity.
I think you also mentioned the instance of check-ins and one-on-ones, like the typical thing where you meet with your manager once or twice a month or something like that. What about that type of scenario?
Yes, and that's a second order impact in many ways of the use of AI. I haven't seen very many instances of people sending a digital twin or a note taker to one-on-one meeting. I have seen some discussion on that. I haven't seen it in practice. But I think the second order effect is, wow, we're in this era of hyper efficiency. We're in the efficiency era. I'm going to cut meetings wherever I can. And I see these leaders at companies like NVIDIA doing this. So perhaps I can do it myself and not have any one on one meetings. And that's where, I worry a lot because the research is overwhelming in terms of those one on one meetings. They're the most important thing a manager can do to support the direct report and to convey that they support the report. And there is a real danger in terms of cutting those one-on-one meetings. Those are the category of meetings that I would resist cutting above any other.
So, what happens to people when this kind of thing becomes prevalent? Do they become less committed to the work? What is the actual danger there?
They become less committed to each other, to the work, to the organization. Shannon, I think commitment is a key word because we often think, in particular around this technology, we often think about efficiency and can the technology do something? We don't often think about the impact on the individuals. And we know that one of the most important things for individuals to feel within organizations is a sense of ownership and commitment and purpose. And the more we're injecting technology, not always, but the more in general we're injecting technology into the process, the less commitment people tend to feel, certainly with each other, the less connection they feel. Often AI is automating parts of work that employees would prefer to keep human because that work gives them a sense of purpose and meaning. And I don't think many organizations are thinking as intentionally as perhaps they ought to be around this commitment piece and the psychology with which we approach work, because often it has so much more weight for the individual than anything outside of it.
Yeah, you had introduced a concept of psychological safety around the use of AI in general. How do you balance that? So you're trying to get people to use AI, but you're also trying to get them to trust you to use it when it's appropriate. So, what
Mhm.
is that experience like for the leadership in companies that are struggling with this now? Because it sounds legitimately challenging.
It is. It is. And here is where, again, Amy Edmondson and so many others have done such great work on this, where this, I struggle to think of anything that is unique to AI in terms of how we should be treating psychological safety. I think there are some nuances in terms of the applications that might be slightly different. But in general, we know a lot about how to create a psychologically safe environment. We know that clarity matters a lot. And we see this with AI. Having a policy for your organization matters a lot. A lot of organizations don't even have a policy in terms of, okay, how are employees supposed to use this technology? How are they supposed to enact it in practice? Also important is a set of principles, right? What are the values we have around this technology? Because that gives employees a lot of clarity in terms of, okay, what is my role now in a world of AI? And it helps them feel more safe in terms of interacting with the technology and interacting with it, knowing that in most organizations, humans still are accountable and humans still very much are in the loop. One of the most important practices for organizations right now to think about is, how do I create an environment where employees feel safe enough to push the boundaries of AI, but also feel safe enough to fail with the technology? Because what we're seeing in the most successful organizations is they are explicitly acknowledging that failure ought to be part of the process. Failure ought to be part of the AI adoption process, the deployment process, the implementation process. And if you're not creating an environment where you are acknowledging failures, sometimes you're celebrating failures if they've been well intentioned, you're not creating that environment where people truly feel safe to use the technology and to push the boundaries. Because I think the biggest competitive advantage an organization is going to have moving forward is creating an environment where employees are mini entrepreneurs in redefining their roles, their tasks, their skill set in the age of AI. This is such a malleable technology that it's not going to come top down. It's going to be the organizations that empower, not top down exclusively, that's important, but it's going to be the organizations that empower their employees to figure out, okay, what are the use cases? What are the value props? How is my role evolving? How ought to it evolve? And how can I learn alongside this technology?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wonder if there's some sort of fear or insecurity with people in positions where they have to put that kind of freedom into the hands of
Yeah.
people on the team, because they're like, oh my gosh, what could they possibly come up with? Sometimes you can't even imagine it, right? So,
Mhm.
what is the best way to cultivate that massive change in your company culture?
I mean, it has to be multi dimensional. It has to be leaders who are doing it themselves, right? They're sharing not only when they succeed with the technology, but also when they fail. It's having that policy where it's clear what are the guardrails. My colleague, Bob Sutton, again, likes to say there needs to be a place for failure within the organization. So for some organizations, this looks like a technical place in the form of a sandbox, where I see a lot of universities going this approach where there's a safe spot that is contained within the organization where employees can test and try these different models and tools. Because what's exciting, but also nerve wracking about this technology is, I think there's a recognition right now, and I certainly believe it, that moving forward, employees will be needing to use multiple different models and multiple different tools day to day. This isn't a technology where we're going to see one frontier model win. The models are leapfrogging each other. And at least for the foreseeable future, employees, in the best cases, are going to be using multiple ones reciprocally throughout the day. So, because of that, you need to create the environment for that. You need to create an environment where you're not locked into one tool. You're constantly exploring new tools, new models, and you're creating safe spaces, and you're doing so responsibly in terms of investing in the right mix of tools and platforms and models that employees are truly able to experiment. Because what we see overwhelmingly is if there's not that environment, the high performers in particular are going to find other ways. And often that looks like using the technology in ways that aren't sanctioned by the organization or using tools that are not sanctioned at large.
Okay. Is that considered an example of looking at failure as a positive thing? At least you tested the boundary and now we know what that boundary is.
No, I think in the best cases, you're figuring out, okay, how do I understand the value of the tool and communicate that to my IT team or the person who approved it? Or how am I using it in my personal life where the risks, the stakes are lower than plugging it into company systems? But no, when we talk about failure, we talk about well-intentioned failure. And I can't think of a case where, failing outside of the explicit guardrails would be something I would recommend.
Okay, so the explicit guardrails is a really important point, and I think that's possibly a challenging thing for leaders to come up with as well. Is there some place or forum or resource where people could learn about how to come up with those guardrails? What's the best way to get started?
It's hard, and I've looked. Certainly, there are some organizations that share guardrails and policies online for their own organization, and I commend them for doing so. I'm not sure if this is still the case, but Walmart did that. Bob Sutton and I did a large report a few months ago. We published it in December, looking at 100 ideas for transforming your work with AI. And so within those 100 ideas, and this is on our Work AI Institute webpage at Glean, there are certainly some ideas in terms of how do you think about policies? How do you think about living, breathing policies? I think this is hard in particular because it is so dependent on the organizational context. It's so dependent on what tools the organization has approved, what vendors they've committed to in the past, the values and mission of the organization, the industry, the employee base. But I think there are general principles within that report that hopefully are useful to folks.
Okay, we'll certainly link to whatever resources we can for people in the show notes. I agree. I have looked too, and I haven't seen a lot that's publicly available on this particular topic. So we'll share what we can and maybe check in with you later. It's a little daunting, right? I mean, you're a leader and you're charged with kind of figuring this out for groups of people, and none of you really have experience with it. So it's an interesting time.
Yes, and I think this is a place in particular where leaning into your employee base can be very effective. When we think about developing policies within our organization, often we think about top down, C suite led initiatives. And I think here is an opportunity because there's so much ambiguity and change, and because employees in general are experimenting and tinkering with the technology, where having that iterative feedback loop in terms of, okay, here's what we think a policy should look like. Here's what we think makes sense. Now, you as employees give us feedback, and we're actually going to act on the feedback and do a second iteration, third iteration. I think that is something that I would recommend leaning on right now.
Yeah. Do you feel like there's an argument for collaboration with AI that makes it more effective than collaborating with other human beings on the team? What are you seeing out there in terms of the evidence that it's working?
So we're seeing a mixed bag. I think that's the headline for AI in general. We are certainly seeing examples where the human prefers to interact with AI over a human, whether that's a colleague or there's lots of great research. There's a fantastic researcher, Lindsay Cameron, who's done a lot of research on Uber drivers, rideshare drivers, in terms of, okay, what does it look like for your boss to now be an algorithm or powered by AI? And in many cases, people prefer that because it is objective, right? Not always, but often it's clear what you're being evaluated based on. And that for many people gives a level of comfort and predictability that humans often do not. And so I think what's happening is employees are either consciously or subconsciously comparing, okay, what was the before state when it comes to your interaction with a manager, for example? Did you have a super supportive manager who inspired you and uplifted you and remained objective? Or did you have a less effective manager, in which case probably you're going to prefer those interactions with AI, even if they are centered on some of these high stakes, sensitive topics like performance management. I think it's the comparison. And for every individual that looks slightly different in terms of their preferred level of interaction with the AI. And certainly it differs depending on the application. Is it for performance reviews? Is it for loneliness at work? Is it for advice? Is it for mentorship? Is it for learning new skills? The receptiveness to the technology differs according to the application, certainly.
Yeah, that makes sense. I wonder too, this is a transitional time. Maybe in 20 years, uh, everything will be different because we'll all have some experience at that point in interacting with AI.
Yes. And, I think another part of that evolution, an important part, is this shift from generative AI to agents, right? Because interacting and managing generative AI looks quite different than managing an agent. And in theory, we're all going to become, if we're not already, managers of agents, and that requires different skill sets as well. So, what I've seen in previous research is people who are accustomed to delegating work pre AI are significantly more likely to then delegate work to the agent because they've developed that mental muscle, and it's less of a cognitive leap to go from a human to an AI as well. And so that's another form of comparison, in a sense of, we've developed skills pre AI that are now more useful for certain types of AI interaction in the AI era, and that should influence how receptive we are to the interaction.
Wow, that's really interesting. I have not heard that insight before, but your level at the time that you start to adopt the AI might actually affect the way you interact with it because of the muscles that you've developed in your current role.
Mhm.
Okay. What gives you the most optimism about what AI could do to help organizations get better in the future?
I am really excited for the application of AI to help us improve how we work together. Collaboration is something that we spend 85 to 90% of our time on at work. Historically, it's been quite invisible, right? It's very hard to end a workday knowing who you've collaborated with, how effective that collaboration has been, how could you improve that collaboration. With AI, that starts to become possible. And if AI is embedded in the organizational ecosystem, the technical ecosystem, and more broadly, it's able to help us have a much clearer sense of how we've collaborated and whether that collaboration has been effective inside of meetings, but also outside of meetings. Are we seeing that the IT team and the HR team aren't collaborating? They aren't collaborating well. Their collaboration has dipped over time. Are we seeing the Tokyo office not collaborating with the San Francisco office? What are the characteristics and fingerprints of the highest performing teams within the organization? What do they do differently in terms of collaboration? There's fascinating research to show that the highest performing teams actually flex their language depending on what they're trying to accomplish. And so when they're trying to be creative, they're using different types of language versus when they're trying to coordinate work and move work forward. And the researchers used AI to make that determination because AI is very well suited to analyze our language and do so at scale. And that becomes really exciting because we can become, as leaders, as managers, as individuals, as organizations, much more intentional about how we're designing teams, designing organizations, and use that 85-90% of time that we spend on collaboration as a lever rather than closing our eyes and hoping it works out well.
Yeah. I'm sure there are a few places where you feel like we could be better at seeing around corners. In terms of using AI in a way that's having the impact that we want, and let's assume that's a
Mm.
positive impact.
I think the biggest pitfall, at least among the biggest pitfalls right now, is the treatment of AI as a personal productivity tool. And we're seeing that manifest in a whole bunch of different ways. But overwhelmingly, we're seeing individuals, teams, organizations treat this as an individual productivity tool. How can I get my employees or myself to do more with less? What quickly happens is people may very well maximize their individual productivity, improve their individual productivity, but they do so at the cost of the team or organization. Concretely, how this looks like now is AI slop. You're creating lots more content. You're creating content more quickly, but you're then dumping that content onto other humans in a way that either requires a lot of rework to then make it more human because it's been generated by AI, or it's just overwhelming people and they're getting AI notifications and AI content in a quantity and velocity that they cannot handle, or sending the digital twin to the meeting instead of showing up yourself, right? We're not thinking enough about the team and organization. And that is why we see in the data productivity gains at the individual level. And then it nosedives in terms of, okay, is the individual actually being more productive at large? It's that gap that I worry about, and I worry is exacerbated as AI becomes even more ingrained in our day to day.
Okay, that's a wonderful point. Where can people learn more? It sounds like there's a lot of really interesting research going on.
There's so much great research going on. I lead the Work AI Institute at Glean, and we have some really exciting, important research planned for this year. The report I mentioned is on that site. My website's RebeccaHinds.com. So I have a lot of my research on AI and collaboration and meetings there. I'm a big fan of Charter. They put out a newsletter every week, I believe. I spoke over the years at their events, and they just published yesterday a playbook on AI transformation based on a compilation of a whole bunch of great speakers that have spoken at their events. Ethan Mullick was the other one. If you're not following Ethan Mullick on Twitter, I would recommend it. He has such a grounded view of where this technology is right now. And he's arguably the best suited to make that determination because he is incredibly technical and incredibly brilliant. And I think the breadth and depth of his analyses, very much from a research lens, he's a professor at Wharton, I think is something I would recommend everyone do.
Okay, thank you so much. This is really fascinating. I think you're so fortunate that you're doing what you're doing at this time. There's just endless angles and places to investigate. I appreciate that you're doing this work, and I look forward to coming back to you in the future.
This podcast is an original production of Women in Product. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the Women in Product YouTube channel. Leave us a review so that others can discover us, or share this episode with someone you know. Original music provided by Jenny Hahn. Thanks for joining.